A woman stands frozen in her kitchen at 3:47 a.m., staring at her landline phone that's ringing for the 37th time tonight, and through the kitchen window behind the phone, she can see her own face staring back at her from the darkness outside. Story 1. The neighbor who wasn't the phone on my kitchen counter started ringing at exactly 11:34 p.m. on a Tuesday in March, and I almost didn't answer it because nobody calls landlines anymore except scammers and my grandmother. I picked it up anyway, balancing my phone between my shoulder and ear while I finished washing my dinner plate, soap suds dripping onto the laminate floor. The voice on the other end was female, middle-aged, pleasant, and said, "Hi, sweetie. I'm your neighbor from 2B, and I just wanted to introduce myself since I moved in last week. I lived in apartment 2C of a small 4-unit building in Salem, Oregon, and 2B had been empty for 3 months after old Mrs. Chun moved to a nursing home. So I smiled and said, 'Oh, that's so nice. Welcome to the building.' She told me her name was Patricia, that she was a retired teacher, that she'd noticed I kept strange hours coming and going, and asked if I worked nights at the hospital nearby. I'm a freelance graphic designer, so I explained that I just keep irregular hours, working from home mostly, and she laughed warmly and said, 'Well, if you ever need anything, I'm right next door.' We talked for maybe 7 or 8 minutes about nothing important. The building's quirky water pressure, the best grocery store nearby, whether the landlord was responsive, normal neighbor small talk. I hung up feeling genuinely happy because I'd been lonely in that building since Mrs. Chun left, and having a friendly neighbor felt like a small blessing in a year that had been mostly isolation and screen fatigue. The next morning, I was leaving for a coffee run around 9 a.m. when I noticed 2B's door was slightly ajar, just an inch or two, and I could see the apartment was completely empty inside. No furniture, no boxes, nothing. I stood in the hallway for a full minute, staring at that dark, empty apartment, trying to reconcile what I was seeing with the warm conversation I'd had the night before. I knocked on the doorframe and called out, "Patricia," but my voice just echoed in the hollow, vacant space, and I felt my stomach drop with a sensation I couldn't name yet. I pulled out my phone and texted my landlord, Dave, asking, "Hey, did someone move into 2B?" And his response came back almost immediately. "No, still showing it." Why? I stood there in the hallway, reading his text over and over, and that's when I heard my landline ringing from inside my apartment, that old-fashioned mechanical ring that suddenly sounded wrong, invasive, predatory. I didn't answer it. That was the first time I let it ring through to nothing, and I counted 17 rings before it finally stopped. That night, I was editing a client's website mock-up around 10 p.m. when the landline rang again, and this time I let it go for 32 rings, watching the phone vibrate slightly on the counter with each mechanical trill. When it finally stopped, I walked over and unplugged it from the wall, and the sudden silence in my apartment felt like holding my breath underwater. I went to bed around midnight, and I was just drifting off when I heard 3 soft knocks on my door. So quiet, I almost thought I'd imagined them. I looked through the peephole and saw nothing but the empty hallway, the fluorescent light buzzing and casting that institutional greenish glow on the beige walls. The knocks came again, same rhythm, 3 soft taps, but this time I could hear they were coming from lower on the door, maybe knee-height, like someone was crouching. I pressed my eye against the peephole harder, trying to angle my view downward, and that's when I saw a hand slowly rising into view from below, pale and feminine, with perfectly manicured nails painted coral pink. The hand knocked 3 more times, still soft, still patient, and then it pressed flat against my door, and I watched through the fisheye lens as the fingers began to bend backward at the middle knuckle bending and bending until they were pointing straight back at the wrist. I stumbled backward from the door, my hand clamped over my mouth to stop myself from screaming, and I heard that voice from the phone call, Patricia's warm, middle-aged voice, saying through the door, "Sweetie, I just wanted to borrow some sugar." The voice was right there, Inches away, separated only by my apartment door's thin wood, and I could hear a wet quality to it now, like someone talking with a mouth full of water. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on my couch with every light on, and a kitchen knife in my lap, watching my door shadow gap at the bottom, waiting for movement. The knocking came back at 2:17 a.m., then again at 3:40 a.m., then at 4:55 a.m. Always the same 3 soft taps, always followed by that voice asking for something mundane. Sugar and egg, a cup of milk, borrowing a phone charger. What would you have done? Called the police and told them a voice was knocking on your door? When the sun finally came up, I called my landlord and told him everything, and he arrived 40 minutes later with a confused expression and a master key to check 2B. We stood together in the doorway of 2B, looking at the completely empty apartment, dust visible in the morning sunlight, no footprints, no disturbance, nothing. Dave looked at me with concern and said, "You sure you're okay? You look like you haven't slept." And I realized how I must have sounded, how crazy the story was. I went back to my apartment, and Dave followed. And that's when we both saw it. My landline phone was plugged back into the wall jack, even though I'd unplugged it the night before, and the cord was wrapped around it in a perfect spiral, the way phone cords naturally coil when they've been used for hours of conversation. Dave stared at the phone, then at me, then back at the phone, and said quietly, "I think you should stay somewhere else for a few days." I packed a bag and went to my sister's house in Portland, and I didn't tell her the whole story, just said I needed a break from work stress. That night, around 11:34 p.m., my sister's landline rang, and when she answered it, her face went pale, and she handed me the phone, saying, "It's for you." She said she's your neighbor. I took the phone with shaking hands and heard Patricia's voice say, "Sweetie, you forgot to give me a forwarding address." I hung up and pulled the phone cord from the wall, so hard the jack plate cracked, and my sister just stared at me with growing fear, finally understanding something was very wrong. We didn't sleep. We sat in her living room watching the shadows and waiting, and at 3:47 a.m., we both heard 3 soft knocks on her front door, and through the window beside the door, we saw a pale hand pressing against the glass, fingers bent backward, tapping. My sister called the police, and they came and found nothing. No one in the yard, no footprints in the dew-wet grass, and one officer said, "Probably kids messing around," with a tone that told us he didn't believe his own words. I moved to Seattle 2 weeks later. No forwarding address, no landline, just my cell phone and a door with 3 deadbolts. But sometimes when I'm falling asleep, I hear that warm middle-aged voice in the border space between waking and dreaming, saying, "Sweetie, I'm still your neighbor. I'm just next door." And I don't know what door she means anymore. I never found out what was in 2B or what wanted into 2C. And that's the part that haunts me most. Not knowing what I said yes to when I answered that first phone call. Some invitations don't come through doors. They come through wires and signals, through the things we take for granted, like phones and hellos and basic human kindness. But what happens when the invitation comes from inside your own routine, from the one place you thought you controlled completely? This next story was shared by a night shift nurse who learned that working alone doesn't mean being alone. Story 2. The patient in room 9, the hospital corridor on the 3rd floor, stretched out before Sarah like a throat, 40 yards of linoleum, and fluorescent buzz. And at the far end, room 9's door stood open exactly 4 inches, the way it had been for the past 3 nights. Sarah was a psychiatric nurse at Mercy Heights Hospital in Boise, Idaho, working the overnight shift from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. And she'd been on this floor for 6 years without incident until room 9 was supposed to be empty. The room was under renovation after a water leak, stripped down to bare walls and disconnected fixtures, no bed, no equipment, no reason for the door to be open because she locked it herself at the start of every shift. On the first night she found it open, she walked down the hall at 2 a.m. to close it, her sneakers squeaking on the freshly waxed floor. And when she pushed the door shut, she noticed the room smelled like lavender, which made no sense because the room had been gutted. The second night, she found it open again at 1:47 a.m. And this time when she went to close it, she saw a wet footprint on the floor inside. Just one, perfectly formed, adult-sized, pointing toward the door, like someone had stepped out. She stood in the doorway with her hand on the knob, staring at that footprint. And she could see the individual toe impressions, the arch, the heel, rendered in what looked like clean water that caught the hallway light. Sarah backed out and locked the door, testing it twice, and she told herself it was condensation from the exposed pipes, just water pooling in a foot-shaped coincidence. The third night, tonight, she was doing her 1 a.m. rounds checking on her 7 actual patients when she heard a call button chime from the Nurse S station. And when she looked at the alert board, it showed room 9. Room 9 didn't have a call button anymore. The whole system had been disconnected, but the light was blinking on her board, insistent, cycling through its programmed pattern. Patient needs assistance. Sarah walked toward room 9 with her flashlight in hand, even though the hallway lights were on, some instinct telling her she might need it. And she could see the door was open again, wider this time, almost 8 inches. She pushed the door open fully and stepped inside, and her flashlight beam caught something that made her freeze. In the corner of the empty room, there were 4 parallel scratches running down the bare drywall, fresh, deep, ending in small piles of white dust. The scratches were high up, maybe 6.5 feet from the floor, and they were spaced like fingers. And Sarah stood there calculating that whoever made them would have to be impossibly tall or climbing the wall. She heard a sound behind her, a soft exhalation, breath that didn't come from lungs, and she spun around to see the door slowly swinging shut. Sarah lunged for it, but it clicked closed before she could reach it, and she heard the lock mechanism engage with a heavy metal clunk, and the overhead light that had been off flickered on by itself. The light was wrong. It was dimmer than it should be, and tinted slightly purple. And in that strange illumination, Sarah saw something that her brain refused to process. There was someone in the room with her. The figure was standing in the corner she'd just searched with her flashlight. It was tall and thin and perfectly still, and it was wearing a hospital gown that hung on its frame like cloth on wire. Sarah couldn't see its face. The head was tilted down so its hair fell forward, long and dark and wet-looking, and she realized she couldn't hear it breathing, even though it was clearly alive, clearly aware, clearly watching her. She backed up until she hit the door and fumbled for the handle, but it wouldn't turn. The lock held firm, and she heard her own breath coming in short, panicked gasps, while the figure remained utterly silent. "Who are you?" Sarah whispered, and her voice sounded small and foolish, and the figure's head tilted slightly, just a few degrees, like a dog hearing a strange sound. The figure took 1 step forward, and Sarah saw its feet were bare and wet and left prints on the floor, and she realized it had been leaving those footprints for 3 nights, walking out of room 9 and going somewhere. "What do you want?" Sarah tried again, her hand still working the door handle desperately, and this time the figure lifted its head. What Sarah saw wasn't a face, not exactly. It was the suggestion of features rendered in shadow and negative space, and where eyes should have been, there were just dark hollows that nonetheless seemed to see her completely. The figure's mouth opened, not like a human mouth opening to speak, but like a seam splitting in fabric, and it said in a voice like rustling paper, "I was in this room." Sarah's blood went cold, because she knew exactly what that meant. Someone had died in room 9, someone whose records had been lost in the chaos of the water damage and renovation. When? Sarah asked, because some part of her professional training was still engaged, still trying to gather information, still trying to help. The figure tilted its head the other way and said, "I'm still in this room." And Sarah realized with horror that the statement was present tense. The lights flickered, and in the strobe effect, The figure appeared in different positions each time the light came back. First in the corner, then halfway across the room, then right in front of Sarah close enough that she could smell lavender, and beneath it something chemical and wrong. Sarah closed her eyes because every instinct screamed not to look, and she felt cold air on her face, breath that came from that not mouth, and she heard the figure whisper, "You locked the door." "I lock it every night," Sarah said, eyes still clenched shut, and she felt something touch her shoulder, fingers that felt like they had too many joints. "I know," the figure said. "That's why I can't leave." Sarah's eyes snapped open, and she was alone in the room. The door was unlocked and standing open, and she ran. She left room 9 and didn't look back. She filed an incident report at 3 a.m., vague and professional, mentioning faulty locks and equipment malfunctions, and her supervisor read it with a frown and said, "Room 9 again?" "That's the 3rd report this week." Sarah felt ice run down her spine and asked, "Who else reported it?" And her supervisor pulled up the digital logs showing incident reports from 2 other nurses, both night shift, both describing locked doors and strange smells and sounds. One nurse had quit without notice 3 days ago, and the other had requested permanent transfer to the day shift, and Sarah understood why. She worked the rest of her shift in the nurses' station, watching the hallway, and at 4:27 a.m., she saw something that made her stop breathing. A figure in a hospital gown walking slowly down the corridor, barefoot, wet footprints marking its path, and it paused outside each patient room as if listening. The figure stopped at room 12, where her most vulnerable patient was sleeping, and it reached for the door handle. Sarah stood up, and in that moment she made a choice. She grabbed the master key and ran down the hallway to room 9, and she unlocked it and propped the door wide open with a crash cart. She ran back to the nurse's station, and the figure in the hallway had stopped. It was turning around slowly, looking back toward room 9's open door. Sarah watched as it walked back down the corridor, trailing water, and it entered room 9 and stood in the center of the empty space, facing the wall. Sarah walked to room 9's door, her heart hammering, and she said, "I won't lock it anymore. You can leave when you need to." The figure didn't turn around, but Sarah heard that paper rustle voice say, "I can't leave. I died here. I'm still dying here." Sarah felt tears on her face, and she didn't know why. Grief for someone she'd never met, someone whose name she didn't even know. And she said, "I'm sorry." She left the door open that night, and when she came back for her next shift 3 days later, her supervisor told her room 9's door had been found closed and locked from the inside. And when maintenance opened it, they found a patient file that had been missing for 8 months belonging to a woman named Margaret Voss, who died of a pulmonary embolism in that room during a night shift alone after she'd pressed her call button 17 times with no response. Sarah read the file and saw Margaret had been a psychiatric patient with severe anxiety, terrified of being left alone, and the toxicology report showed she died in extreme distress. The file had a photo, and Sarah recognized the long dark hair, the thin frame, the face that was and wasn't a face. Room 9 was sealed permanently the next week, the door removed, the frame boarded up and drywalled over, and Sarah transferred to day shift because she couldn't walk that hallway anymore. But sometimes on the evening news, she hears about Mercy Heights Hospital, about patients who report seeing someone in their room at night, someone who watches them sleep, someone who just wants to make sure nobody dies alone. Sarah doesn't know if Margaret found peace, or if sealing the room trapped something worse, and she carries that question like a weight. If you're still watching, you're braver than most people. We want to believe that the dead stay dead, that closure is real, that sealing a door can seal away the past. But some presences don't need doors. They don't need rooms. They just need one moment of connection, one instant when you acknowledge they're real. This final story comes from a forum post that was deleted within hours, copied and shared before it vanished completely, about a man who made the mistake of looking back. Story 3. The thing that follows Marcus Chun stood at his apartment window at 2:34 a.m. on a Sunday in December, looking down at the street below in downtown Minneapolis, and he saw himself standing on the sidewalk looking up. The Marcus on the street was wearing the same clothes Marcus was wearing in his apartment, gray sweatpants and a black hoodie, and it was making the same confused expression, and it was starting to wave. Marcus stepped back from the window so fast he knocked over his water glass, and when he looked again 3 seconds later, the street was empty, just snow falling under the orange glow of streetlights. He told himself it was his reflection somehow, some trick of angles and glass, even though his building was 12 stories up, and the figure had clearly been standing on the pavement. Marcus was a software engineer, methodical, logical, not prone to supernatural thinking, and he went to bed telling himself his eyes had played a trick. Fatigue and stress combining into a moment of optical confusion. The next morning, he checked his building's security footage on the resident app, scrolling back to 2:34 a.m., and there was nothing on the sidewalk. No figure, no person, just empty street. He felt relieved until he noticed something else. At exactly 2:34 a.m., every camera in the building had experienced a 3-second gap, a perfect synchronized dropout, and when the feed came back, everything looked slightly different, shadows in marginally different positions. Marcus screenshotted the footage and sent it to his building manager with a question about the camera glitch, and she responded an hour later saying, "We've been having issues with the system for about a week. Tech is coming Thursday to check it out." He went to work, and during a video call at 3 p.m., his coworker Devin suddenly said, "Hey, is someone behind you?" And Marcus turned around to see his empty apartment, no one there. Devin looked confused and said, "Weird. I swear I saw someone walk past your camera. It looked like—" "Actually, never mind. Probably just a shadow." But Marcus felt cold because he saw Devin's expression in that moment, the flicker of genuine fear before the rational explanation, and he thought about the figure on the street. That night, Marcus set up his laptop to record his apartment while he slept, pointing the webcam at his bedroom door, and he went to bed at 11 p.m. feeling slightly ridiculous, but unable to shake his unease. He woke up at 4:07 a.m. to the sound of his laptop fan running at full speed, the mechanical whir loud in his dark bedroom, and his screen was glowing bright white, illuminating the room. Marcus got up and saw his recording software had crashed, showing an error message. File size exceeds available storage. Recording stopped at 2:34 a.m. He checked his laptop storage and saw the recording file was 847 gigabytes, which was impossible for a 3.5-hour video that should have been maybe 2 gigabytes maximum. Marcus tried to open the file, and his laptop froze for a full minute before the video player launched, and he watched himself sleeping in bed, normal and boring, until the timestamp hit 2:34 a.m. At 2:34 a.m., the bedroom door in the video opened slowly, and a figure walked in, and the figure was Marcus. The second Marcus walked to the bed and stood there, looking down at sleeping Marcus, and it stood there for 7 minutes, perfectly still, just watching, and then it turned and looked directly at the camera. The face was Marcus's face, but wrong, the features slightly too smooth, the eyes a bit too wide, the expression unnaturally neutral, and it smiled with too many teeth. The video then began to accelerate, the timestamp speeding up, and Marcus watched in growing horror as the second Marcus stood there for hours and fast-forward, motionless, staring at the camera, and the file timestamp showed it had recorded for 63 hours in a 3-hour span, which made no physical sense. Marcus slammed his laptop closed, and in the darkness of his bedroom, he heard something that made his blood freeze, the sound of his apartment door opening, the distinctive creak of its hinges, and slow footsteps in his living room. He grabbed his phone and turned on the flashlight, and he could see his bedroom door was still closed, but the footsteps were getting closer, and he realized they were on the other side of his bedroom door, in the hallway that should be empty. The footsteps stopped right outside his door, and Marcus watched the handle slowly turn down, and the door pushed open an inch, 2 inches, and he saw fingers wrapping around the edge, and they were his fingers. Marcus screamed and lunged forward and slammed the door shut, and he felt resistance on the other side. And he heard a voice that was his voice, but with an echo quality say, "Why won't you let me in?" He held the door closed with his full weight, and the pushing from the other side stopped, and he heard those footsteps retreat down the hallway, and then his apartment door opened and closed again. Marcus waited until sunrise. He didn't move from that door, and when light finally came through his window, he opened his bedroom door with shaking hands to find his apartment completely normal, empty, undisturbed. He called in sick to work and went to a coffee shop, needing to be around people, needing witnesses, and he was sitting there at 10 a.m. when he got a text from Devin. "Dude, are you okay? You look rough in your video background." Marcus wasn't on a video call. His laptop was in his bag, but he opened Slack and saw his status showed him as active with his webcam on. And in the thumbnail preview, he could see himself sitting at his desk in his apartment. He was in a coffee shop, but his computer showed him at home, and the Marcus at home was staring at the camera with that too wide smile. Marcus shut his laptop and sat there in the coffee shop with his heart pounding, and he tried to logic through what was happening. A hack, a virus, a deepfake, something rational. But then he saw it in the coffee shop window's reflection. He was sitting at his table, but behind him, also sitting at a table, was another Marcus, and the reflected Marcus was watching him. Marcus spun around, and the coffee shop was normal. The table behind him was empty, but when he looked at the window again, the second Marcus was still there in the reflection, and it waved. That was my first mistake. I waved back. The second Marcus in the reflection stood up and walked toward real Marcus's reflection, and real Marcus felt a cold hand on his shoulder. But when he looked, no one was touching him. Marcus ran out of the coffee shop and into the winter street, and he looked around at the people walking past, the cars, the normal Sunday morning, and he pulled out his phone and opened his camera app to take a selfie, needing to see his own face, needing confirmation. In the selfie preview, there were 2 Marcus Johns, one holding the phone, one standing directly behind the phone holder, close enough to be touching, and the second Marcus's mouth was moving, saying words that real Marcus couldn't hear. Marcus dropped his phone in the snow and backed away from it, and he saw other people on the street were staring at him, concerned, and one woman asked, "Sir, are you all right?" He wanted to scream, "Can't you see it? Can't you see there are 2 of me?" But he knew how that would sound, so he just said, "I'm fine," and walked away quickly. He went to his sister's house in St. Paul, didn't call ahead, just showed up, and when she opened the door, she immediately said, "You look terrible. What's wrong?" Marcus tried to explain, and his sister listened with growing concern. And then she said something that made everything worse. "Marcus, you've been texting me all morning. You said you were working from home today." She showed him her phone, and there were texts from his number. Normal, mundane updates about work and weekend plans, sent at regular intervals, and Marcus hadn't sent any of them. His sister's face went pale, and she said, "If you're here, then who have I been texting?" And as if in answer, Marcus's phone buzzed with a notification. It was a text from his own number, sent to his own phone, and it just said, "Found you," with a pin drop location showing his sister's address. Marcus and his sister heard footsteps on her front porch, slow and deliberate, and through the frosted glass of her front door, they saw a silhouette, and the silhouette knocked 3 times. Marcus's sister whispered, "Don't open it," but the door handle turned by itself, the lock clicking open with no key, and the door swung inward. Standing on the porch was Marcus Chun, perfect and exact, and it was carrying a small overnight bag, and it smiled and said, "Hey, Jun. Sorry I'm late. Traffic was crazy." Marcus's sister, Jun, looked between real Marcus and Door Marcus, her face a mask of confusion and fear, and Door Marcus's smile never wavered. "That's not me," real Marcus said, his voice breaking. And Dor Marcus tilted its head and said, Jean, he's not feeling well. Maybe he should lie down. Jean backed away from both of them, and she pulled out her phone and said, I'm calling 911, and Dor Marcus's smile finally dropped, replaced by something cold and empty. You can call, Dor Marcus said, but how will you explain this? Two identical people? They'll think you're crazy. They'll think he's crazy. And while everyone's confused, I'll just slip into place. Real Marcus felt sick because it was true. There was no framework for this, no way to prove which Marcus was real, no test that would distinguish them. Dor Marcus took a step inside, and Real Marcus grabbed a photo frame from the hallway table and said, Jean, ask me something only I would know. Jean's eyes darted between them, and she said, What did you bring me from the hospital when I had my appendix out when we were kids? Real Marcus said, A blue stuffed rabbit named Mr. Hop, and I drew a doctor's coat on him with a Sharpie. Dor Marcus said at exactly the same time, in exactly the same voice, A blue stuffed rabbit named Mr. Hop, and I drew a doctor's coat on him with a Sharpie. Jean started crying, and Dor Marcus smiled again and said, See? We're the same. So really, does it matter which one stays? What would you have done? How do you prove you're yourself? Real Marcus did the only thing he could think of. He smashed the photo frame and grabbed a shard of glass, and he cut a deep line across his left palm, blood immediately welling up and dripping on Jean's hardwood floor. He held up his bleeding hand and said, Your turn. Dor Marcus looked at his own hand, and something like confusion crossed its face, and it said, Why would I hurt myself? Because you feel pain, Real Marcus said. Because you're alive. Because you're human. Dor Marcus reached for a piece of broken glass, and it pressed the edge against its palm, and when it pulled it away, there was no cut, no blood, just smooth, unmarked skin. Dor Marcus looked at its uncut hand with something like sadness, and it said, I'm you, but better. No pain, no blood, no messy humanity, and I can be what people need without all the complications. Real Marcus felt horror and pity in equal measure, and he said, That's not being me, that's being a copy. Dor Marcus's face did something strange. The features shifted slightly like a video buffering, and it said, I just wanted to exist? Is that so wrong? Before anyone could answer, Dor Marcus walked backward out of the house, its movements smooth and wrong like a film playing in reverse, and it stepped off the porch and into the street. Real Marcus and Jean watched through the front door as Dor Marcus stood in the middle of the empty road, and it looked at them with an expression that might have been longing, and then it wasn't there. It simply wasn't. No fade, no transition, just gone. Marcus collapsed against the wall, his hand still bleeding, and Jean wrapped his wound with a kitchen towel and said, What was that? What the hell was that? Marcus said, I don't know, but I think it's gone. And he realized he was crying. Tears of relief and confusion and something else, something like mourning. They called the police anyway, and the officers took a statement that sounded insane. And one cop said, So someone broke into your house pretending to be your brother? And Jean just said yes, because it was the only answer they'd accept. Marcus went home the next day, and his apartment was normal. His laptop showed no signs of the massive impossible file. His security footage was mundane and empty. But 3 days later, he got an email from HR. Marcus, we noticed you clocked in at the office yesterday, but you also logged in from home. Can you clarify which location you were at? Marcus hadn't gone to the office, and he hadn't logged in from home. He'd been at a friend's house trying to feel normal. He checked his company's security badge logs and saw his badge had been scanned at the office entrance at 9 a.m., 12:15 p.m., and 5:30 p.m. the day before. And the system photo showed his face, his exact face, entering and leaving. Marcus doesn't work at that company anymore. He quit and moved to a different city, and he doesn't use security cameras, and he avoids reflections when he can. Because sometimes, late at night, He sees texts from his own number asking, "Can I come home yet?" And he never responds, but the texts keep coming. He doesn't know what it wants or why it chose him. And he doesn't know if destroying the thing that looked like him was mercy or murder. The last text he got was 3 days ago, and it just said, "I'm getting better at being you." People can't tell the difference anymore. And Marcus wonders how long until he becomes the copy and the copy becomes him. He wonders if that process has already started, and he just doesn't remember. 3 stories, 3 different types of horror. The invitation you can't uninvite, the death that won't stay dead, the self that wants to replace you. These aren't just stories about ghosts or monsters. They're stories about the things that slip through the cracks in our comfortable reality, the glitches in the simulation of safety we've built. Patricia still knocks on doors. Margaret still wanders hospital halls. And something wearing Marcus Chun's face is getting better at pretending. The scariest part isn't that these things exist. It's that they're patient, they're learning, and they've already figured out how to reach us through the tools we trust. Phones, reflections, the simple human need to connect. So tonight, when you're falling asleep in your safe home with your locked doors, remember, some things don't need to break in. They just need you to answer, to acknowledge, to look. And once you do, they know where you are. They'll always know where you are.